Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore, our remote events program. I am Elizabeth from Gibson's, the events coordinator, and I am here with 3 authors and 2 books. We have Hannah McCarthy and Nick Capodice, who have written, they are the hosts of New Hampshire Public Radio's CIVIC 101 podcast, and their book is A User's Guide to Democracy, How America Works, which is a lively crash course in how the U.S. government works. They are joined by author Seth Masket, author of Learning from Loss, The Democrats 2016 to 2020, in which he presents the strategic choices the Democratic Party made after losing the 2016 presidential election. They will be discussing civics. They will be discussing elections. They will be discussing lots of things back and forth. These books are both available from Gibson's Bookstore. We are very happy to ship, offer curbside pickup, or in-store shopping. If any of you in the audience have any questions tonight about the books, about civics, about civic process, if you have, Hannah mentioned, any question about civics that you have always been a little bit embarrassed to ask, like at this, I don't know what it is, and at this point I'm embarrassed to ask, feel free to drop it in the chat sidebar or into the Q&A. I can ask it anonymously if you want, and we will get these answered. Folks, thank you for joining us tonight. Please tell me a little bit about your books, how they came about. Seth, let's start with you.
Hi, I'm Seth. Thanks so much for organizing this, Elizabeth. I really appreciate this. So I'm a political scientist at the University of Denver. I have been writing about political parties for a long time, but I was particularly interested for this book in dealing with the decisions that a party makes. That is, there's actually been quite a few good books out there about those decisions, about the decisions that a party makes, who to nominate, what stances to take, what stances to minimize. But all those books tend to assume that there's some sort of a conversation that occurs beforehand between different aspects of the political party, between activists and elected officials and official party leaders and interest group leaders and other people. I wanted to capture that decision. I wanted to capture that conversation going on between different wings of a party. And I was really focused on following things after the 2016 election, focusing on the losing side of an election and getting a sense of how people within the party were interpreting why that loss came about and what they could learn from it. So there's a lot of different aspects of the research within this book. I focus on like election returns and campaign finance patterns and other things, but a lot of it was really conversations I had with in the early contest states, in New Hampshire, in Iowa, in South Carolina, Nevada, as well as Washington, D.C. And I contacted a bunch of political activists starting pretty early in the cycle, so starting like in early 2017, and had conversations with what ended up being about 65 people, asking them why they thought Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump in 2016, and then who they were thinking about for 2020. And I had several follow-up conversations with them over the next few years, leading up to right before the New Hampshire primary. And that first question, why do you think Hillary Clinton lost? That could be like an hour-long conversation just on that. People had a lot of opinions about it. There was a lot of different, basically, narratives that emerged from that election, and people still don't agree exactly why that election came out as it did. But one of the, not necessarily the dominant, but one of the more persuasive arguments that came out of that was what you might call the identity politics argument. I know that it's kind of a loaded term. It means a lot of different things to different people, but it was this idea that Hillary Clinton and Democrats did poorly in 2016 because they focused too much on underrepresented groups. That is, they were focusing on the needs of African Americans and Latinos and the LGBT community and women and others, and didn't really offer anything to so-called working class white voters who felt left out and thus voted Republican, voted to the candidate who was speaking to them, who was Donald Trump. Regardless of whether that is a true account of 2016, a number of people within the Democratic Party came out of that election believing it. And that really shaped how they were thinking about who they should nominate next time around. And it really created a situation in which basically a moderate older white candidate, older white male candidate, had a real advantage in that nomination contest. And as long as Joe Biden was around, as long as he was doing reasonably okay in debates and other things like that, a lot of people within the party just ended up converging on him out of fear of repeating what happened in 2016. So I really followed that conversation and just followed what was going on with that, and found that the party essentially made a choice for Joe Biden by the end of 2019, long before people started voting in the caucuses and primaries. But it was a great opportunity to do this research. I made a number of visits to Concord and Manchester and a number of other places in New Hampshire, and really enjoyed doing the work. But I think it's an account of how a party goes about making a decision. And I don't know, I learned a lot from the experience personally.
Seth, I have so many questions for you. we can introduce our book, but I have because I'm always longing for any opportunity on the show to ask about what happens behind the curtain. Like, truly, what are those conversations that are going on? You watch a show like Veep and you hear that people in Washington say, yeah, it's kind of like that. Really? Tell me more. So I can't wait to hear more about that. Shall we introduce?
Sure. We should talk. You want to talk about the show and the book?
Sure. And I've got a loud cat walking into the room. I just have to warn quite loud. There she goes.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, for those of you who are from New Hampshire and listen to New Hampshire Public Radio, you may have heard of Civics 101 in the past. It's a show that we started shortly after the 2016 election. We were not the initial hosts. The wonderful Virginia Prescott was. She's now at Georgia Public Broadcasting. And when she went to Georgia Public Broadcasting, Nick and I, who were producing on the show, were given the opportunity to step in as hosts, and we kind of changed the whole format around and started to try to create a real narrative arc to each episode that we were doing. But the reason we started the show is because all of a sudden you had people writing into the station asking, when I say those questions that you are maybe afraid to ask, people were starting to ask them, like, whoa, what is the Secretary of State? What does the Secretary of State do? Or how does an executive order work? Or really, how does a bill become a law? Because suddenly I think people were grasping at these basic democratic principles that they maybe felt were slipping away. And if they were slipping away, they wanted to understand exactly how they worked so they could preserve them. So we started this show, and it only generated more and more questions. And we have never had a shortage of them. Nick and I right now, we are producing 3 episodes a week based entirely on listener questions. People write into the station. I just made an episode about who and what the Solicitor General is, which I was totally unaware of, considered the 10th Justice on the Supreme Court, and had to really try to dig into how is the Solicitor General not stepping over the line of the executive branch into the judiciary. And at the end of that episode, as I so often find at the end of writing a lot of these episodes and having these wonderful interviews, is that there are still strong democratic principles in place, and people are still executing them, and in full faith and with true belief in these systems and a desire to preserve them. The opposite is also going on, but it's always reassuring to know that there are still good actors, and we are able to, at the very least, find out, even if things are not being executed exactly as they ought to be, how they ought to be executed, so that you, the listener, or you, the reader, can know that and can raise your hand or call your congressperson and say, hey, I noticed that you're messing around with democracy a little bit. And let's talk about that. So that's the basics of the show. I don't know, Nick, you want to get into the book?
Yeah, well, I have a copy. I have a copy of it here next to me. The book started out, and kind of like how we started out hosting the show, it was truly serendipitous. I started to work for the show in NHPR as the education outreach producer. I was coming up with ways to make sort of the show a bit more fun and usable in the classroom for students. And then, as you said, when Virginia left, we started hosting. We could sort of kind of, goof it a little bit in the narrative and telling a story. But my first day coming into work at NHPR, like a week before my first day, I was like, you know what, I need the primer. I need like a crash course. I had watched the crash course in American democracy on YouTube. It was like, but I need the book that's like got kind of everything in a digestible, lovely little format, and it didn't exist. So when Hannah and I were approached to, work on this project with the immensely talented New Yorker cartoonist Tom Toro, we decided to make just that book, to try to put in as much as possible, as basic as possible, in a fun way that's got fun illustrations. Another thing that was important about this book and the show, two big important things. One was that we try our best to be nonpartisan. Sometimes our beliefs like sneak out in our writing, but we truly try to approach this from an anybody can read it perspective. And we do that with the show too. And the other is, it's like in the wake of the 2016 election, I was just hitting F5 on my Reddit newsfeed obsessively and just trying to devour as much information as possible. But I did not have a grasp of the fundamentals, admittedly. So people are out there writing hot takes on this and that. And unless you just sort of go back, slow down, start with Magna Carta and work your way through Articles of Confederation, the Declaration of Independence, Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Federalist Papers, and then just sort of this nutty experiment that we are, truly to its basis level. It's fascinating. And every interview we've done, every piece of research that we did for this book, I've learned something new, sometimes horrible, sometimes wonderful and funny, but new all the same.
Yeah. And I would say, while we wrote a book about the very basics, it was so important to us that it not be textbook. And we tried to apply the same principles that we had started applying on the show, which was to introduce these characters throughout history who have stepped onto the stage laid out by our founding documents, and see how they worked with that blocking, and whether or not they did a decent job. They revealed potential cracks in the system. They revealed needs for amendments and bills and conversations and massive shifts in elections. And it's only through the way that we watch people over the course of history take and use these foundational principles can we really understand what they're good for. So that's a big part of the book, is just taking note of, for example, the most important Supreme Court cases over the course of history, including anti-canon. What were the horrible decisions that were made that stood as law until someone finally said, hey, we made a huge mistake. And that's another thing that happens over the course of American history, which is fascinating. People who declare something, absolutely rigid can then walk it back in the course of their own career. So there's always a shot for redemption, which is, it's heartening. Shall we chat?
Yeah, if anybody has any questions about anything particular. Seth, I was curious about, I really was curious about, because we did a section and it's in the book. It's about like how sort of, how recent the phenomenon of red states versus blue states is, this notion of these colors representing these two parties. This recent, it was from 2000 is the first time that expression was used in the public eye. I couldn't believe that. So, has it, is that kind of when a shift happened in the party, like when we started to really they started to truly diverge in that way?
Do you mean in just like the use of those colors?
Yeah, did the use of those colors tied to the notion of there being like red states and blue states, and then the memes started after the election? Like, was that like a point when things really did start to diverge more?
It's actually kind of fascinating. 2000 really is kind of the cutoff there. In coverage, like just an election before that, like 1996, different news networks had different standards for which party they applied to which color. And in a lot of other democracies, traditionally, blue is the color of a conservative party and red is the color of a liberal party. So it happened to be that a number of networks had kind of settled in 2000 on red for Republican, blue for Democratic. And the weirdness of that election, in which everyone saw that map for like a month because the election was still undecided, where you still had like a yellow Florida too close to call, it really kind of burned those colors in, and Republicans started playing up look how red the country is. This is really ours, and people started talking about, well, how are the blue states different? It's so that, yeah, this only goes back 20 years that people started identifying hardcore with these colors as associated with the parties. It's kind of interesting. There's a great website I use fairly frequently, the USA Atlas of American Elections, put together by David Leap. He started that in the 90s, and so it still sticks with blue for Republican, red for Democrat. And he's standing by that. He refuses to change for anyone. I respect that. But it's if you look at those maps, it can be a little confusing when you first see it.
Yeah.
There's actually a question for you,
There
Seth,
is a
and this is
question.
one you can field. I'll read it to you. For the 2020 election, why did the Democrats choose an old white man rather than a younger eligible candidate?
That is a good question.
So that's a question right there.
Yeah. The Democrats had so many choices in 2020. I mean, you had like 24 people, in the summer of 2019 showing up for different debates and other events like that. In many ways, the Democrats came out of 2016. They were very disoriented. A lot of people I spoke to, a lot of activists I spoke to coming out of that election they couldn't figure out what had gone wrong. They were kind of messed up about it, and it kind of threw off what their expectations were about politics. So whether they should trust polls or not. It threw off a lot of their own instincts. And there's a metaphor I use in there, seeing Hillary Clinton as kind of the new Coke candidate. That is, the Democratic Party had gone with her. All the market research said this was going to be a great product, that people would like it, and then it failed. And they didn't fully understand why. And some were like, well, did we sell this wrong? Did people not like the flavor? Were there other things going on in the market that we just didn't get a sense of? And since they couldn't agree, they decided to go with, let's just get back to classic Coke as quickly as we can. And in some ways, they felt like an older, moderate white guy was the sort of candidate they've used in the past and has brought them some success, and they thought would help them out. And there was also a sense that that would bring back some of the voters that they felt they lost. And that is, again, that's just one interpretation of that election, that it might bring back the sort of the more moderate working class white voters who had drifted over to Trump in 2016. It wouldn't necessarily deliver, younger voters of color who had, in many cases, decided not to vote in 2016. But this seemed to be a decision that a lot of people in the party made, and I think it gave Biden a real big advantage coming out of that.
I've always wondered, in those moments after a failed election for one party or another, are there analysts standing at the ready? Are there campaign staffers who have prepared for this? They ran the projections. They could have at least seen it coming in one way or another, and they're already laying the groundwork for what comes next. How quickly do people shift gears and get onto their new plan?
I mean, it's interesting to watch that happening in real time. If you're like following the news coverage on election night and you see like something is, in particular when something different happens than what was expected, people kind of scramble to come up with narratives. And more often than not, some of those early narratives really kind of stick in people's heads, even if they're just kind of made up on the spot. I remember, I teach at the University of Denver. We hosted a presidential debate back in 2012, the first debate between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama. And I was sitting there watching it. I had a bunch of news interviews lined up for right after the debate. And, it occurred to me as I was watching that I don't know who to turn to tell me what just happened. I think I'm the one creating this narrative right now for these local newscasters. And so, I was like, wait, I don't know what to say. So I had to come up with, whatever the fake spin was. And I'm like, I don't think Obama's doing that well. Does that sound right to anyone? And they're like, yeah, that works. So, you see these things get generated in real time. I actually have a little study in there of how newspaper coverage changed in the wake of the election. Usually there's this pattern where lots of different news reporters and opinion writers have lots of different viewpoints about why an election came out as it did, but they tend to converge on a narrative after a few weeks. That really didn't happen after 2016. In fact, like the news coverage became more and more dispersed about just why that election came out as it did. People are still confused about why it came out as it did. So, and it was a close enough and weird enough election that a lot of different ideas seem right. Like, you know, anything could have flipped a few thousand votes in Michigan or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania. So it was really, it's kind of a perfect storm for weird narratives.
Yeah.
Can I ask you all a question?
Oh,
Yeah.
please, yes.
Yeah, you mentioned the 2000 election. One of the things I was thinking about coming out of that is that because that was so close and it came down to Florida, and all of a sudden we were talking about like ballot design and how counties administer elections and things like that. And just suddenly very weird, wonky parts of the American political system became suddenly hugely important. And I was wondering, this seems like a similar election in that sense. And like all of a sudden we're talking about like the fine details of the Electoral College and how states certify these things. And there's a role that the GSA plays that no one ever knew about. And I'm wondering, you know, is it hard to keep up with this? Do you feel like, oh, wait, we have to include this in the next round of this book? We're going to have questions in the 2024 election? Or
It's joyous because the fodder is truly ceaseless, right? And we did an episode on the GSA, and we're like, nobody has ever mentioned this position before, and how delightful that we get to, you know, to do this. One thing I will note though is like I think it was 2016 or 2014, a poll had a terrible result in sort of the strength of American civics education. It was like fewer than 1 in 4 people could not name the 3 branches of government. Not so in 2019. In 2019, it's like 60%, 56% can. So we're getting a heck of a lot better in response to 2016. But Hannah, were you gonna say something about some minutia that's been kind of interesting in the last?
I've actually, it feels like for the first time, listeners and just the general American public actually want to talk about federalism, which is such a joy to me because I've been just had my teeth sunk into federalism for a while now, because I'm an armchair philosopher and it's just so satisfying to read Publius. But it was really remarkable to, even after making a series of episodes that were like, now look, this election's going to be different. It's going to take longer. You think we're just saying that. We're not just saying that. You know, state election law is different from state to state to state, and that is going to dictate absolutely how this election goes. It could take up to a month. And you still had people furious that were, what is this with the Georgia runoff? What's going on, right? And for me, it's been just an absolute pleasure to say, okay, this is over and over again, just like a masterclass in federalism, in state versus federal law, and really finding that it boils down to state law and people at the federal level trying to get their foot in the door there, and it's just not really working because one of the essential principles is that states are allowed to govern how their elections work. So to be able to make an episode about the Georgia Senate runoff, which I'm happy to answer any questions about if people have any questions about, has been really enjoyable. And I think to dig into things that you would think most people would find fairly banal and boring and suddenly don't is very satisfying for people like us.
I will say though, likewise, things that are just had never really been addressed are just fomenting and coming to the top. Like someone asked, you know, will we add Puerto Rico and DC as a state? And I was like, oh God, when's the last time I thought about like adding states? What's the process for adding states? And I called a political scientist from Howard University, and he said, you know, this is an example of constitutional hardball, and anybody who says that adding states shouldn't be a political process should look at what happened in 1889 when we added 12 states overnight, basically, to give the Republicans the election in 1890. It's always been a political process. So what happens in Georgia is it's crazy. It's going to affect what would happen if we had a 50-50 split in the Senate. And another thing I was shocked to learn about researching the book is just these norms that come up over again. These things I accept as gospel, but they're just norms, like the nuclear option, like the filibuster rule. These can be changed in the Senate rules when new Senate start. What's going to happen in the Senate is the thing I'm just most interested to see.
Yeah, we've got a number of questions.
Oh, yeah.
Dig into them. First from an anonymous attendee. Is polling broken and can it be fixed?
Man.
I don't know. Do you want to start,
So,
Seth?
Sure. It is not broken. So the polling in 2020, it looks like it was probably off, nationally, maybe by about 3 percentage points, which is actually kind of typical in a presidential election. 2016 was actually closer, but it called for the wrong winner, basically. So people fixated a lot on that. So it's for polls to be off by 2 or 3 points is actually not a huge error. There's one particular thing that has become a problem, and that is we have 2 elections in a row where polls have understated Donald Trump's support. And not by a lot, but it seems to be a pattern. The polling was pretty much dead on average in the 2018 midterm elections when Donald Trump was not on the ballot. Pre-election polls were very close in predicting what was going to happen in Congress and in state races. But again, Donald Trump seems to have produced some Republican turnout that the polling kind of missed. And I don't think we have a great idea exactly why that happened, whether some Republicans are less likely to simply participate in polls than Democrats are, whether they're actually giving incorrect information, whether some people just sort of change their mind at the last minute. It's kind of hard to say. I don't know if this is going to be a problem going forward, but so far we're not looking at like massive problems. Like generally, we're talking about the Georgia runoffs. Those are calling for right now they're suggesting a very close race there. And those are probably right. We'll see what ends up happening, but I don't think we have particular reason to doubt those polls right now. I'm curious what your take on this is.
Yeah, I did a very short episode on, just about how long this election night was going to last, election month was going to last. And my big takeaway from that is that you're just going to see a lot of stations allowing their analysts to rely on those polls a bit, but not anywhere as much as you may have seen, and correct me if I'm wrong, Seth, but in the Bush-Gore election. There was a lot of scrambling that night. A lot of calling was made one way or another for stations to keep up with one another, and you certainly didn't see that in this election. And when you saw, when you see the AP call something, the AP is the most conservative estimate of any of the polling that's done. So if you're seeing the AP do that, you can always sort of lean on that as the safest bet. And I actually know the AP and Fox split off this year to form their own little polling initiative. They used to have a larger consortium with a number of different networks, and they have a different approach to it. We as the electorate, we're so hungry for the answer, right? And so stations are going to try to give us something. But yeah, my only advice is focus on the AP, right? And try to be patient.
There's a really interesting comment that I just want to read from Eve.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's Oye or Oye. If it was Oye, how nice would that be for a Supreme Court chat? She wrote, so it sounds like the media essentially started this distinction of states as essentially aligned with one party or another. It makes good coverage when we have 2 clearly separated teams with their own colored jerseys. But this is such a simplification, as we've seen in the past election where several states flipped as if this was a seismic shift. How about the media taking a more open-minded approach that downplays these artificial distinctions? I think that is a fascinating comment question. The media, by the way, it was David Letterman. David Letterman was the first person to say red states and blue states, so you can call him with his beautiful bushy beard. But Eve, like I am in the media, right? So I work in the media, but I will say there was like a month of people staring at a red and blue map. A map just like desperate to find out who the next president was going to be of the United States. I was in college at the time. I'll never forget that month. When you're staring at a map of 2 colors, I mean, I can't help but think it started to create this. I wouldn't necessarily agree to blame the media necessarily, but I do agree with that. I do think that your point is very interesting. I'll just say that.
I think part of that is the way, I think in some ways it's a function of the Electoral College. And that all these states are winner take all. You win just a narrow edge over the other candidate, and you get all of their electoral votes. So we tend to think, if the state just like Pennsylvania went for Trump in 2016, and so it became a red-colored state. But it didn't take that many votes to switch it back to blue in 2020. And I think it can be a mistake to throw a state like that can really flip back and forth in with a state like, say, Idaho or California, where it really is going to be for one party for a very long period of time. And just thinking it in terms of like winner take all and thinking of the whole state as one color, I think can be a little misleading.
Hannah, there's a question for you, unless you want to hop in on red states, blue states.
Well, I want to answer Vin first. I don't know that I can answer Vin, but I'm going to read this question out. The earlier discussion makes it sound as though Biden was inevitable from the start, making it sound as though a rational decision that the party makes as one entity. It is a rational decision the party makes as one entity. But until South Carolina, he was hardly in the picture. He had lost badly until then. What was amazing to me was how quickly he got other candidates to get behind him. The dynamic of those couple of days after South Carolina fascinates me. This is one state. What might he have said to the other candidates?
Can I jump in on that?
Yeah,
Okay.
We're waiting on you.
So yeah, this is a great question. I was so fascinated watching this, happen in real time back in February. So it was interesting. First of all, like if you go back before that, like 2019, a lot of the conversation among, in Democratic circles was this, given how big a field of presidential candidates this is, given how diverse the field of candidates is, things might not go the way Iowa and New Hampshire want. Right? People are sort of downplaying some of the early states and saying, given how white and rural some of these states are, should we be putting everything in their basket? So I think that there was sort of downplaying what the early vote might look like. And then you had this really kind of fascinating thing where, Pete Buttigieg very narrowly wins the Iowa caucuses, although we don't know about that for several days to weeks later. Bernie Sanders wins in New Hampshire. If you watch what happened after that, one of the things I do in this book is I look at endorsements by prominent Democrats, basically Democratic members of Congress and governors and other folks, just to see that can be kind of a signal for how a party is leaning. And Biden was leading by that measure by the end of 2019 and throughout January of 2020. But a lot of Democrats were still holding back and waiting to see what was going to happen in those early elections. Buttigieg wins in Iowa. He gets like maybe one or two Democrats jump out and endorse him at that point. Sanders wins in New Hampshire. I think one or two people endorse him at that point. And then Joe Biden wins in South Carolina. Suddenly 30 Democratic members of Congress endorse him within a few hours of that. And I think and they were following the lead of Jim Clyburn, the congressman from South Carolina. That far more than anything that Biden said to the other candidates, that sent a signal to them that the party was largely behind Biden at that point. And that sent a signal to people like Amy Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg and Elizabeth Warren that this just isn't the year for me. This is not going to happen. And so suddenly all these candidates drop out and voters are kind of left with this choice of Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. And, it wasn't that the party necessarily changed a lot of voters' minds and forced them to vote for Biden or anything like that. It just kind of restricted their choices and just said, look, these are who we're running now. You have a choice between these two candidates. And suddenly Biden was doing extremely well within a really short space of time when the party just suddenly kind of converged on him at pretty much the last minute right before Super Tuesday.
Thanks, Seth.
Hannah, this one's for you.
I'll take this one.
This is from Bill. I never learned about the Federalist Papers in high school. I know they're important, but are they something I should read and learn more about? Or is the Reader's Digest version enough? I've got a side answer to your answer, Hannah.
Sure. I would say it truly all depends on how much you care about how people interpret the Constitution and how much you want to have your own version of an interpretation of the Constitution. Do you want to know how the men, not just the men who wrote it, but the men who both wrote it and were pushing really, really hard to get it ratified? How much do you want to know about what they believed they were saying? I personally am going to recommend that the Reader's Digest version is not enough because I've read the little synopses of each of the Federalist Papers versus reading the Federalist Papers in full. And I never find them satisfying, or that they can effectively communicate these essays, because these tend to be really well-structured, well-argued essays that build upon themselves. And so when you read James Madison's arguments, when you feel the full force of his argument, why he feels that X, Y, or Z in the Constitution ought to be seen this way, at the very least, you're getting this incredibly fortunate glimpse into this brilliant man's mind and the way that people were thinking at the time. And then on top of that, you can then take that understanding and look at how our Supreme Court justices and others in our history have interpreted the Constitution since. Are they, if we talk about textualism or originalism, is their version of originalism based on what James Madison said, or is it based on the way that they interpret the language in the Constitution? That might be closer to textualism. And then you've got the anti-federalist papers as well. You've got people who are afraid that the Constitution is going to strip us of state sovereignty, and the people who we can really thank for the Bill of Rights, because even though James Madison didn't want it, he said, all right, uncle, fine, I will give you this. Take it, whatever, no big deal. Ended up being the biggest deal, right? That's the thing that so many of us focus on, are our rights. But all of that is just beautifully laid out in these papers. It's a lot to read, and depending on who the writer is, it's a lot of Hamilton and Madison. It's a teeny bit of Jay. Madison's the best, in my opinion. Hamilton's pretty fiery, though. I recommend reading them, but Nick, what's your...
No, I just want to say, I wanted to sort of concur. I wanted to say whatever you can read and like really digest is what you should read and digest, right? I mean, there's Federalist Papers that I read maybe 10 times that if you asked me what it was about, I'd have no idea what to say. Because like sometimes gloss off. These primary source documents are hard to get through. They're written a long time ago. They're written by people using very different styles of language, and you've got to just fess up to that. It's like Shakespeare. Hannah and I both have an acting background, right? So, I come at it the same ways I come at Shakespeare, which is I do as much as I can get to, and then I take a break, and then I come back again and take another whack at it. I suggest, instead of just trying to go from 1 to 80, 85, 84, 83? I can't believe I don't know off the top of my head. Anywho, someone's going to know it in the chat and scold me, and that's totally fine. But is to pick one of them, Federalist 10, for example. Pick that one and read it, and pick an anti-federalist paper. Take Brutus 1. This is the stuff that the kids are learning in AP Gov right now in America, and they know it a heck of a lot better than people I see on Twitter every day. So pick one Fed paper, one anti-federalist paper, read it, and then maybe get the book and keep it around the house and turn to it from time to time. And you'll be an expert in no time.
And you should also know going in, the Federalist Papers were a cohesive effort. The Anti-Federalist Papers were a little more scattered. So they're not going to have their arguments laid out, boom, 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 punch for punch, the same way that the Federalists were doing.
And they all have fun nicknames, right?
Aside from the one Publius.
Aside from the Publius, like, isn't there one that's like the concerned farmer?
Yes, there is. There is a concerned farmer.
Fun pseudonyms.
Yeah. That all have historical significance, which I can get into it. You and I can have our own private conversation about that, but yeah.
You see, when I teach with Federalist 10. I mean, I love that one, and I get something new out of it every time I read it. But like, I never know quite how to think of it as like, is this laying out a political philosophy? Is this a sales pitch for a kind of hastily patched together constitution? I mean, I think in many ways it's kind of a combination of those things, but they also, but they're putting together a philosophy that people will believe for hundreds of years. How do you kind of balance that?
Well, first, actually, Hannah, I would ask, could you just tell us what Fed 10 is about? What is Federalist 10 about, sort of generally, or like?
Were you asking Hannah?
I was asking Seth to tell.
Oh, okay.
You're a political science teacher, just to let everyone know, in case there's anybody there who doesn't know what it's about.
I mean, Federalist 10 is the one, if you teach about political parties, Federalist 10. It's the one that talks about dealing with what Madison calls the mischiefs of faction. Basically the divisions that are in a society, and what's the best way to manage that. And he talks about, look, we could, the one thing we could do, and he talks about all the serious problems that the country would eventually deal with, things like polarization and people just opposing each other for the sake of opposing each other. And he says, look, one solution to this is we just curtail liberty. and make it, we sort of abolish factions and limit what people can say. But that's a problem because we're trying to create a democracy here. So let's not do that. The other approach is to basically have a very large and diverse country with lots of different views that makes it hard for any one faction to actually take over the government. And this was kind of a radical view at the time, where they thought, it was generally thought at the time, democracy could really only exist on a pretty small scale level, otherwise it becomes unmanageable. And he was kind of taking a new approach to this, saying, actually, this works better with a really large and diverse country, because one faction can't take over and run everything. And, it was basically arguing for a very slow and difficult to control federal government that doesn't constrain people's liberties. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, that's excellent. And I think to your question and your point, because I totally agree with you. I think it's both. I think it's supposed to be a tongue-in-cheek sales pitch that is noticing that there are already people that are causing division. And we are just trying to bring this government together, aren't we? And it's a really good idea and it could work. And don't worry too much about it because it's actually going to stop any kind of imposition on your liberties, right? But at the same time, you think about these letters that these men were writing back and forth to one another. And this is another deep dive, Bill, you could go on, but there is a vast archive of letters amidst the framers, where you get every ounce of their anxiety, that they were terrified. Many of them were just terrified that this wasn't going to work, that the nation was going to fall apart, that it would be split. I mean, the reason supposedly Washington, if you look at the letters, agreed to be president is to prevent that, right? Because he saw political factions starting to form already and desperately wanted to stop the flow. So I actually enjoy them more for the moments where it is just sort of like a gentle ribbing against the people who might disagree with them, and manipulative. A lot of, like, Hamilton's manipulative in his writing about factions, but I don't think that invalidates his point, or that he believes his point any less, I guess is how I would take it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a question here. When do you see younger candidates on the presidential ticket instead of old men?
When young people start turning out more?
Yeah.
Sorry. Not
this
more.
Is actually, no, this is a
thing.
fair point, though. Yeah. I'm happy to have you start, though, Seth.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about, the last few Democratic presidents, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, who were both elected president in their mid-40s. They were among the younger presidents that we've had, and at least at those times, the Democratic Party, whether it's party leaders or party voters, sort of liked what they saw in that. A relatively younger leader, someone not heavily invested in the current system, and I think they have generally seen something of an advantage with that. That may have also, in a different, if 2020 had rolled out differently, if Democrats were not looking for someone to run against Donald Trump, you might have seen a different set of incentives there. There's a fair amount of research suggesting that voters of both parties, tend to prefer younger candidates. That is, a candidate in their 70s, they have some worries about that. An older candidate might do a little worse. When it's two candidates in their 70s running against each other, I think that, that concern sort of gets washed out. People don't have as big a problem with that. And I think there was even some sense that actually maybe an older candidate would be a good person to run against Trump. You ended up with a surprisingly older, I mean, these are now the two oldest presidents we've had at this point who had gotten elected. It's kind of fascinating that came about. Had Democrats been looking for someone else or looking to run against a different candidate, they might have not ended up on Biden, but I think just his age was not as much of a concern this time around.
Yeah.
What should we talk about?
Yeah, I feel that you make this point very well, Nick.
Well, no, it's because I know a lot of people, and Hannah, you said you knew a lot of people who perhaps were disillusioned with the choice of candidates for this election. and they chose to say like, well, I'm not going to vote. It's sort of like a protest vote. I'm not going to do that. But candidates will only pass legislation sort of in the way that you're interested in if they see you as a representative voting body, as somebody who does go out and get out the vote. Even if you lose, even if your candidate doesn't lose, if you start being seen by candidates and by the parties themselves as a powerful thing, then your vote really sort of levels you up, if we're thinking in sort of the D&D character way. So this election, I think this could be a bellwether. This was, there was at least quite a big rise in turnout from younger voters during this election. But until that happens, you're not going to see the big party catering to the whims of younger people. What do you think, Hannah?
Yeah. Well, I just want to add, because I completely agree with you, but on a more minute level, you might not consider it minute, but I spoke to a researcher who just been doing a ton of research on polling places and how demographics affected what kind of access you had to polling places. And he found across the board, and this is a very skeptical man who found that by and large, he at the very least over the course of many interviews found that election officials in states were genuinely doing their best to provide a place for people to vote within the election laws that had been established by the legislature. So we have, there's that caveat. That is politics, right? Part of the problem was often that voter turnout was so low in certain demographic areas that in the next election, those election officials did not put enough money in a certain town, or just took that polling place away entirely because the turnout had been so low. And then, people of a certain demographics show up. Let's say that it's like young male Latino voters show up because they've been driven out to vote. And then, because they had low turnout before, there's this horrible de facto disenfranchisement going on because the money's gone elsewhere based on data. So I would just, and now, next year, since they have turned out this year, the data will be different again. That's just my additional encouragement to just show up, represent your demographic. Think of yourself as just a number. Maybe you are nothing but that. And that's great. Use your number.
Especially during midterm elections.
Yeah.
Triple, if you're someone who is, and I don't know who you are, anonymous, I don't know the person asking the question, but if you're a younger person, you should fight like heck to get you and everybody even more than you could have perhaps in a more recent presidential election. Midterms, because fewer people vote, your power is much, much greater. Your vote counts for a heck of a lot more. Also, midterms are when you see people either sort of running away from the president. The president always takes it on the chin in the midterms. So you see a lot more progressive candidates sometimes during midterm. So really nose in those state and local elections, especially during a midterm. And then if that's the change you want, that could be the change you see.
We have one last question here from Vin.
Okay, sorry,
Anonymous is an older voter. Vin says, if I can ask another one, we have heard a lot about the demographics of the 2020 vote based, I am guessing, on exit polls. But if it is based on exit polls, how do we have any sense of who those mail-in voters are, especially if they're almost half of the electorate? And how can we know how a particular electorate voted? How can we count on those polls any more than on the polls prior to the election?
So my understanding is that those who conduct exit polls this year were also reaching out to those who did mail-in voting as well. And they have worked to make that as representative of the actual electorate as possible. There's still a lot of ongoing adjustment of those exit polls going on as these the state vote tallies are being finalized. So more so than in other years, I encourage people to sort of wait on the exit polls to just see, wait for their sort of final adjustment, because a lot of them are just based on some somewhat erroneous early estimations of who actually voted and who turned out. They're getting better as time goes on. But as I understand it, they're as representative of people who voted by mail or voted early as those who actually just showed up on election day to vote. So I don't think that's a real problem. And we do have a sense of how those voters differed, and in their leaning and everything like that.
Yeah. That's been my understanding as well.
Yeah.
There was a lot of phone calls to people who had voted already. And Janine says, thanks for your time. Thanks for coming, Janine.
Thanks,
We're
Janine.
appreciative of your time.
Nice.
buy Seth's book. It's
Yeah.
cool.
And please buy Hannah
It's
Nick.
got nice cover art. Look, it's got a donkey kind of
Yeah.
going down.
I'll grab
that was Jackson, right?
Here's
Andrew
what it looks like.
Jackson embraced the donkey.
Jackson embraced
Yeah.
the donkey because someone called him a
He
jackass.
sure did.
And he was like, I sure am.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thomas Nast did it though for both of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, he did. He did.
On a lot besides. Mhm.
So what do you worry about what's a major misunderstanding you see people having in politics?
I will say, yeah, if we're going to talk about politics without revealing my own, if I can, I have had a lot of conversations with friends who are very angry. You know what? Misinformation, Facebook, it's easy, right? Friends who will say, well, this politician did this, so I can't ever. Or, based on some politicians' behavior in an earlier office 15 years ago, I can't possibly vote for them. And that's, if that's the position you want to take, that's a fine position to take. I encourage everyone to look at how a politician may have voted in the past 10 to 20 years. Are they voting in Congress along the lines of something, rather than the dirt that their opponent dug up on them for the most recent election? Might they serve you as an electorate? That's all. I've become a much more tempered individual in terms of politics since I started researching politics. Maybe to my detriment, who knows? But that's my thing.
For me, Hannah, it's not too far off. It's the people who are scared of one Congress or another doing a ton of stuff, right? That you may not disagree with, regardless what party you're in. Like, fewer in most Congresses, like 3 to 4% of proposed legislation actually becomes a law. Like, and of that, the majority of it is like, the post office is over here is going to be named after so-and-so. We're going to have a guy on a horse over there. It's mostly this sort of, ceremonial stuff. State bird,
or federal
state
bird,
melon. Executive orders that certain presidents pass can be harmful. But also, because they did not involve Congress, which is a famously slow, treacly process, the process of how a bill becomes a law.
They can involve Congress.
They can involve Congress, but
they probably should.
They could also just go off on their own. Executive can do whatever he or she wants.
Yeah.
That means the next administration, if it is a flip from one to another, sorry, Eve, but if it is, then that means that following president can just unwind it. The easier an action for a president is to take, the easier it is for future administrations and different Congresses to unravel it back. There are good and bad things that happen in Congresses and in Supreme Court decisions, my God. But good can come. They can be fixed in future things if you don't like it.
What about you, Seth?
So, one thing that sort of frustrates me, like my focus is usually on political parties, and I think sometimes people understate the influence of parties on their own vote choices and on the political system. If you think of a lot of the media coverage where reporters will go to a diner and interview Trump voters and find out, well, how do you support Donald Trump? Honestly, usually the correct answer is because I'm a Republican and he's the Republican nominee. And I also voted for Mitt Romney, and I voted for John McCain. And, that's just 9 out of 10 times, that is simply the right answer. But that's not generally the answer we want to give. We want to come up with some much more complex story about how, I like the way he did this, or he's very authentic, or he stood up to this person, and I appreciated that. And in fact, generally, we're going to vote for our own party's nominee. And we're going to stick with our party throughout our lives, and we'll come out with some way of rationalizing that afterwards, but it's kind of what we were going to do. I could probably say fairly accurately how I'm going to vote in 2024 and 28 and 32 right now. I won't, but I could, without knowing who the candidates are, and I'll come up with some way of rationalizing it at the time by talking about how inspiring they were or this important debate or something like that. But parties are important because they dictate a fair amount of what's going to happen in this political system.
Yeah, that's a great question. Oh, are we all done? All right.
Are we busted?
We've had a great hour. Do you have more topics that you want to discuss? Because we can keep going. Did you have a question that you really wanted to ask or discuss?
I think we touched on a lot that.
This was
It's
a
great
really
We never got to talk about the Anti-Masonic Party. That
We all wanted to get to that.
I actually
I
mentioned
do-
them in the book.
Oh, you
Oh,
do?
you do?
We
I
also
do,
talk
I
about
do.
the Anti-Masonic.
We do.
Yeah.
Because it actually is interesting.
Also, I don't want to get into it, but we wrote like sort of a concise, quick history of the two parties, and then that's where we get into Whigs and Adams men and Democratic Republicans. But the notion that so the involvement of the party that supported slavery and small government became the party that it is today, that elected us our first Black American president. Parties evolve and realign and change. That's all. Yeah, thank you, Gibsons. This was a blast.
Yeah, thank you, Gibson.
Thank you.
This has been deeply fascinating. It is really easy for politics to get really bogged down and overwhelming. And this has been extremely accessible, which is excellent and very interesting without getting like way too far down. So this has been wonderful. Oh, here's a great question to take us out. I will mention that both of these books are available from Gibson's Bookstore. Eve asks, what makes the panelist most optimistic about American democracy? Does anything make you optimistic? You're all hesitating.
Yes, I will tell you. Well, most recently, learning about the Solicitor General did. And I say that because here is someone who generally really wants to uphold the law. But I think state government makes me optimistic. It might seem really bogged down, but I think you see a lot of officials who genuinely want to foster healthy democracy and are trying to do it. And that is not always in line with what the parties desire when they are trying to get attention from the voter. But I think if we pay very close attention to who it is we are electing, for example, who then controls our election law, we can have more of a say if we show up to those smaller elections. Keep just the slightest finger on the pulse of your state and local goings on, because that, while it's not as sexy, that is where it's happening, and it still is happening, and I would like to keep it alive. So that makes me optimistic, and I think that that's where change actually starts, and we see that when people show up, we see change happen. So
I'm most optimistic about we travel to schools a lot and we do stuff with kids. I'm staggered by the depth of knowledge about civics that 8th graders have versus when I was
So
an 8th
smart.
grader. So smart. And the 1619 project, right? The story, telling the story at its absolute root of how slavery has been involved with this country from the very start. If you try to tell civics and you try to tell history without that story being told well and with representation of who tells it, you're screwing up. And I think we're stopping screwing up now.
For me, I would say, so we just had the highest turnout election since 1900 in the middle of a pandemic. And, that doesn't mean that everyone did so because they're like really high on American democracy right now. Like a lot of people have legitimate concerns. A lot of people are very freaked out right now, but they see the political system, the electoral system, as a way to express those. That's where they're doing it. And people are making themselves heard at an enormous rate right now, and doing it loudly, doing it peacefully. That's actually a very good sign for the health of the country. So that leaves me feeling, I do have some worries about this country, but that leaves me feeling fairly optimistic.
Amen.
On those optimistic notes, that's the end of our hour. Thank you very much to Hannah, to Nick, to Seth. Both of these books are available from Gibson's Bookstore, and we would be very happy to connect you with them. Thank you very much, everybody joining us from home. Have a great night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.